A seriously ill priest, confined largely to his own home, unable even to celebrate Mass in public before a congregation. No one watching his quiet, limited daily life would have expected him to put an archbishop in a genuinely uncomfortable position with only 2 words: "I will not be silent." Because that priest received a formal and unambiguous order: stop writing. A publication ban backed by the threat of canonical sanctions extending as far as suspension from priestly faculties. His offense, stated plainly and without euphemism, was having written in black and white what he sees as the truth about the crisis in the Church today, and refusing to stop saying it when told to. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly who this man is, why his situation reflects something much larger than his own individual circumstances, and why his response to the threat against him has left a considerable number of Catholics, including many who have no particular attachment to traditionalist causes, genuinely without words. But first, who is he? He is not a provocateur chasing online visibility or courting controversy for its own sake. He is an Austrian priest belonging to the Archdiocese of Vienna, ordained in 2019. He comes from an old, noble family, one of those families whose ancestors served the Habsburg emperors across generations, a lineage of cultured, educated men. He was himself a scholar before he was a priest, formed in serious study before he ever approached the altar for ordination. His life, however, carries a wound that has shaped everything about how he now lives his priesthood. A serious illness confines him. He is unwell enough that he can no longer exercise public ministry in any ordinary sense. He does not preach from a parish pulpit on Sunday mornings. He does not sit in a confessional hearing the sins of a queue of the faithful. He celebrates Mass alone, in the small chapel attached to his own home, a solitary priest offering the sacrifice of Christ without a congregation gathered before him. From that solitude, though, he found another way to remain what his ordination made him. He began to write. He describes his articles, in his own words, as his form of pastoral care and preaching, a pulpit made of paper, offered from the confines of a sick room rather than from a church. And in that writing, he said what remarkably few Catholic priests, with far greater freedom of movement and far greater institutional security, have been willing to say. He named the Church's doctrinal confusion. He described what he sees as her advancing ambiguity on matters that were once considered settled beyond argument. He wrote about decline, clearly, directly, and always, he insists, from within the Church, as a son writing about a mother he loves, rather than as an outsider throwing stones at an institution he has abandoned. He was ordained by Cardinal Schönborn, the Archbishop of Vienna at that time, a man he speaks of with genuine admiration, describing him as a gentleman of an older era, someone capable of correcting a subordinate priest gently, through conversation and mutual respect, rather than through decree. Under Schönborn, he says, the dialogue between bishop and priest was always human, always conducted with the dignity that the relationship between a father in God and his spiritual son deserves. Then everything in Vienna changed. Schönborn was succeeded by a new archbishop, Monsignor Grunwald, appointed under the current pontificate. And with that change, the priest says, came letters of a very different character, less friendly, carrying what he describes as an old-fashioned authoritarian tone, the kind of institutional coldness that treats a subordinate cleric as a problem to be managed, rather than a son to be guided. These letters built, over time, toward the decisive one, a curt, unambiguous publication ban issued from above. The substance of it, reduced to its essential message, was this: if you do not comply, you will face sanctions up to and including suspension. All of this, he emphasizes, arrived without what could reasonably be called a proper conversation. Without any discussion of the actual theological or doctrinal content of what he had written. He was not even given a clear account of which specific statements in his published writing were considered the offending material. A ban was issued, a threat attached to it, and the substantive engagement that might have allowed for genuine correction, genuine dialogue, genuine pastoral accompaniment of a sick priest, whose only remaining form of ministry was his pen, never took place. Here the situation arrives at what can only be called its most burning paradox. This is a man who holds no active pastoral assignment. He draws no salary from the archdiocese. He has, in the ordinary institutional sense, almost nothing that the Church could take from him by way of practical consequence, since he already occupies no formal position from which he could be removed. And yet, he suggests, it is precisely his relative public visibility, the reach his writing has achieved despite or perhaps because of his illness and his isolation, that has made him a useful example. Punishing him sends a message to others watching from positions of greater institutional exposure. There is a further detail that borders on the genuinely absurd and that deserves to be placed alongside the publication ban for what it reveals about the character of this relationship. More than a year before the ban was issued, he says, the same archbishop had invoked the language of priestly obedience to request that he pay the German church tax, the Kirchensteuer, a civil registration fee tied to formal church membership in Germany. Confusing a demand for money with a matter of spiritual obedience, he observes dryly, is simply not acceptable. The juxtaposition, an appeal to obedience deployed first over a tax payment and later over a publication ban, tells its own story about how the language of obedience has been used in this specific relationship. But it is his response to the threat that deserves the most careful attention, because in the face of the possibility of suspension, this sick and largely housebound priest did not yield. He offered instead a sentence that has already begun circulating well beyond Austria and has taken on something close to the character of a personal manifesto. He recalled the memory of a beatified priest, Father Rupert Mayer, a Jesuit who confronted Nazism directly during the darkest years of the 20th century, and who repeated, under a regime that demanded his silence on pain of much graver consequences than an ecclesiastical suspension, the same three words: "I will not be silent." And to that memory, the Austrian priest added his own conviction. No priest, he wrote, should remain silent, least of all in the face of abuses occurring within the Church herself today. This is not a model chosen carelessly or for rhetorical effect. Father Rupert Mayer openly and repeatedly challenged the Nazi regime from the pulpit, was arrested multiple times, was held in concentration camps, and continued his resistance until his health was permanently broken by what he endured. Invoking that specific legacy is a serious act. The Austrian priest is placing himself, consciously and deliberately, within a lineage of clergy who concluded that when institutional power, whatever form it takes, demands silence about what conscience recognizes as a serious wrong, conscience must take precedence over the demand. He then addressed directly the objection that anyone following this story would immediately raise. What about obedience itself? Every priest at his ordination promises obedience to his bishop and to that bishop's legitimate successors. Is silence, then, simply his plain duty as an ordained man under a lawful superior's direction? His answer is stated with a clarity that leaves little room for misreading. Obedience, he insists, is owed first and before anything else to Christ, present and active within his Church. It is never, under any circumstance, meant to function as blind obedience, obedience severed from its proper object and redirected toward whatever a given superior happens to demand, regardless of content. Anyone who interprets priestly obedience in that unconditional, uncritical sense has misunderstood what the promise actually means and what it was always meant to protect. A bishop who suppresses freedom of legitimate expression today, he warns, sets a precedent that will be used to restrict other rights tomorrow. And there is no natural place for that logic to stop once it has been accepted as legitimate. When obedience is invoked in a way that overrides basic human dignity and conscience, he argues, it ceases to function as a virtue and becomes instead a form of spiritual abuse, exercised by those with institutional power over those without it. In fairness, and this needs to be said clearly before going further, canonists would have something legitimate to say in response to the priest's strongest formulations. The Church is not a democracy in the way modern secular institutions understand that term, and a bishop genuinely does possess real authority over the public writings and statements of the priests incardinated in his diocese. This is not a minor technicality to be waved away. The relationship between a bishop and his priests carries real juridical weight, and a diocesan ordinary has legitimate grounds, under specific circumstances, to ask a priest to moderate or cease public commentary that the bishop judges harmful to the good of souls or to ecclesial unity. That authority is not itself the abuse. Acknowledging this is simply honest. But the real issue in this specific case is not whether a bishop possesses that authority in the abstract. It is the method by which it was exercised, and above all, the double standard that surrounds its exercise. And this is precisely where the priest's own writing hits its most difficult and most uncomfortable target. Today, he writes, it has become entirely ordinary to impose bans and threats of suspension on those who simply profess the faith the Church has always taught, while those who publicly criticize priestly celibacy, who advance positions that verge on or cross into open heresy, who question core Catholic doctrine in print and in public forums, continue speaking, writing, and teaching entirely undisturbed, protected by an institutional silence that never seems to produce a comparable letter, a comparable ban, or a comparable threat. Pause on that observation because it is the entire argument distilled into a single contrast. A sick priest defending the faith as the Church has received and always taught it, faces the threat of suspension. Meanwhile, theologians and clergy who openly question doctrines the Church has defined across centuries continue to publish, to lecture, to hold academic and pastoral positions without any comparable institutional consequence following them. This is, in his own description, the inverted image of a Church that presents itself publicly as listening and open to every voice. Listening to whom, precisely? Open to whom? Not, it would appear from this specific case, to those whose only offense was preserving what the Church has always handed down. And on the particular word that has dominated ecclesiastical vocabulary throughout this pontificate, synodality, the priest is direct in a way that few clerics with active pastoral assignments would risk being. No one, he insists, actually knows with precision what the word means. He goes further, in language that is genuinely strong and that we report here as his position, rather than a conclusion this channel is independently endorsing. He describes synodality as a mechanism for introducing ideas foreign to the Catholic tradition into the life of the Church, while presenting those ideas through careful and reassuring vocabulary as though they were simply the Catholic faith itself, evolving in continuity with what came before. And he names what he sees as the underlying contradiction directly. A Church that claims as its foundational posture a willingness to listen to everyone somehow manages in practice to silence specifically and consistently those who have remained faithful to receive doctrine. The proof that this contradiction is real, he writes without hedging, is his own case, laid out for anyone to examine. It is genuinely difficult to argue with that specific point when it is placed directly beside a letter demanding his silence under threat of canonical sanction. There is also the matter of the ancient Mass, which this priest discovered, by his own account, precisely because of the restrictions and bans surrounding the traditional liturgy in recent years. Curiosity born from prohibition led him towards something he says he had not previously encountered with the same depth. In that liturgy, celebrated now alone in the chapel of his own home since illness has removed him from any wider public ministry, he says he rediscovered the Catholic faith in what he experienced as its purest and most unadorned form. The priest does not spare his language when describing his overall assessment of the current state of the institution. He goes as far as saying that the Church is completing what he calls a disaster, and that her true leader, in the deepest and most ultimate sense, is not the Pope, but Christ himself. A clarification is genuinely necessary here, and it reflects this channel's own position rather than an editorial softening of what he said. These are very strong words, and we report them as his own, not as conclusions we share or endorse. We do not agree with the tone in which they were expressed because the Pope remains the Pope, the visible head of the Church that Christ established on the rock of Peter, and the Church belongs to Christ through Peter, not against Peter or around him. That distinction matters and should not be blurred by the emotional force of an individual priest's frustration, however sympathetically that frustration might otherwise be understood. One important thing, however, must be said clearly in his favor and should not be lost in the strength of his rhetoric. This man is not a sedevacantist. He explicitly recognizes the Pope as Pope. He celebrates the Mass in communion with Rome. He has not repudiated the obedience he promised at ordination to Christ working within his Church. He does not want to leave the Catholic Church. He wants, by every indication in his own account of himself, to remain within her, faithful to what he was ordained to guard, even while enduring what he experiences as institutional pressure to abandon that fidelity in its public expression. And even setting aside whatever excesses appear in his harshest formulations, one fact remains that is very difficult for anyone to deny honestly. A sick but genuinely faithful pastor, a man with no active assignment, no salary, no institutional power of any kind beyond a readership built through his own writing, is being treated by his diocese as a problem requiring management and containment, rather than as a son whose concerns, however sharply expressed, deserve to be heard and addressed on their substance. So what does this story actually teach those of us observing it from outside Vienna, outside Austria, outside the specific relationship between this one priest and his one archbishop? It teaches first that courage inside the Church has not disappeared, whatever else might be said about the current moment. There remain priests who, sick and largely alone, would rather risk formal suspension than betray what their conscience tells them they must say. Christ is my judge, this priest says in effect. No one else holds that final authority over my conscience. It also reminds everyone watching of an old and genuinely comforting truth, one the priest himself invokes explicitly. Once a priest, always a priest. No letter from a chancery, no administrative decree, no threatened sanction can erase what the sacrament of holy orders has permanently configured in a man's soul. The Masses this priest continues to celebrate alone in his home chapel remain, regardless of any dispute with his archbishop, entirely and fully valid, exactly as they were before any of this began. But above everything else, this story asks something concrete of anyone who has followed it this far. Not simply outrage directed at a chancery in Vienna, prayer. Prayer for this priest, alone in his room, carrying an illness that has already taken so much of his ordinary priestly life from him. And prayer, in equal measure and without bitterness, for his archbishop and for the Pope himself, that the Church might learn again to listen to her faithful sons rather than treating their fidelity as a threat requiring containment. Because a church that silences her faithful children while tolerating, without comparable consequence, those who openly question her doctrine does not grow stronger through that asymmetry. She grows more isolated, more brittle, more disconnected from the very faithful whose loyalty has always been her actual strength across 20 centuries of far greater crises than this one. And the quiet voice of an elderly, ailing priest, alone in a chapel in his own home, saying simply, "I will not be silent," may in the end carry more weight before God and before history than 1,000 documents carefully written to say as little as possible. What do you think? Leave a comment below. Amen. God bless you.